Book 4, Chapter 4 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Estenson. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. Book 4, Chapter 4. Father Benwell's Correspondence. To the Secretary, S.J. Rome. When I wrote last, I hardly thought I should trouble you again so soon. The necessity has, however, arisen. I must ask for instructions from our most reverend General on the subject of Arthur Penrose. I believe that I informed you that I decided to defer my next visit to 10 Acres Lodge for 2 or 3 days, in order that Winterfield, if he intended to do so, might have time to communicate with Mrs. Romayne after his return from the country. Naturally enough, perhaps considering the delicacy of the subject, he has not taken me into his confidence. I can only guess that he has maintained the same reserve with Mrs. Romayne. My visit to the lodge was duly paid this afternoon. I asked first, of course, for the lady of the house, and hearing she was in the grounds, joined her there. She looked ill and anxious, and she received me with rigid politeness. Fortunately, Mrs. Eyrecourt, now convalescent, was staying at 10 Acres, and was then taking the air in her chair on wheels. The good lady's nimble and discursive tongue offered me an opportunity of referring, in the most innocent manner possible, to Winterfield's favorable opinion of Romayne's pictures. I need hardly say that I looked at Romayne's wife when I mentioned the name. She turned pale, probably fearing that I had some knowledge of her letter warning Winterfield not to trust me. If she had already been informed that he was not to be blamed, but to be pitied, in the matter of the marriage at Brussels, she would have turned red. Such at least is my experience, drawn from recollections of other days. Footnote. Father Benwell's experience had, in this case, not misled him. If Stella had remained unmarried, Winterfield might have justified himself, but he was honorably unwilling to disturb her relations with her husband by satisfying her that he had never been unworthy of the affection which had once united them. End of footnote. The ladies having served my purpose, I ventured into the house to pay my respects to Romayne. He was in the study, and his excellent friend and secretary was with him. After the first greetings, Penrose left us. His manner told me plainly that there was something wrong. I asked no questions, waiting on the chance that Romayne might enlighten me. "I hope you are in better spirits now that you have your old companion with you," I said. "I am very glad to have Penrose with me," he answered, and then he frowned and looked out of the window at the 2 ladies in the grounds. It occurred to me that Mrs. Eyrecourt might be occupying the customary false position of a mother-in-law. I was mistaken. He was not thinking of his wife's mother. He was thinking of his wife. "I suppose you know that Penrose had an idea of converting me," he said suddenly. I was perfectly candid with him. I said I knew it, and approved of it. "May I hope that Arthur has succeeded in convincing you?" I ventured to add. "He might have succeeded, Father Benwell, if he had chosen to go on." This reply, as you may easily imagine, took me by surprise. "Are you really so obdurate that Arthur despairs of your conversion?" I asked. "Nothing of the sort. I have thought and thought of it, and I can tell you I was more than ready to meet him halfway." "Then where is the obstacle?" I exclaimed. He pointed through the window to his wife. "There is the obstacle," he said in a tone of ironical resignation. Knowing Arthur's character as I knew it, I at last understood what had happened. For a moment I felt really angry. Under these circumstances, The wise course was to say nothing until I could be sure of speaking with exemplary moderation. It doesn't do for a man in my position to show anger. Romayne went on. "We talked of my wife, Father Benwell, the last time you were here. You only knew then that her reception of Mr. Winterfield had determined him never to enter my house again. By way of adding to your information on the subject of petticoat government, I may now tell you that Mrs. Romayne has forbidden Penrose to proceed with the attempt to convert me. By common consent. The subject is never mentioned between us." The bitter irony of his tone thus far suddenly disappeared. He spoke eagerly and anxiously. "I hope you're not angry with Arthur?" he said. By this time my little fit of ill temper was at an end. I answered, and it was really in a certain sense true. "I know Arthur too well to be angry with him." Romayne seemed to be relieved. "I only trouble you with this last domestic incident," he resumed, "to bespeak your indulgence for Penrose. I am getting learned in the hierarchy of the Church, Father Benwell. You are the superior of my dear little friend, and you exercise authority over him. Oh, he is the kindest and best of men. It is not his fault. He submits to Mrs. Romayne, against his own better conviction, in the honest belief that he consults the interests of our married life. I don't think I misrepresent the state of Romayne's mind and mislead you when I express my belief that this second indiscreet interference of his wife between his friend and himself will produce the very result which she dreads. Mark my words, written after the closest observation of him. This new irritation of Romayne's sensitive self-respect will hasten his conversion. You will understand me that the one alternative before me, after what has happened, is to fill the place from which Penrose has withdrawn. I abstained from breathing a word of this to Romayne. It is he, if I can manage it, who must invite me to complete the work of conversion. And, besides, nothing can be done until the visit of Penrose has come to an end. Romayne's secret sense of irritation may be safely left to develop itself, with time to help it. I changed the conversation to the subject of his literary labors. The present state of his mind is not favorable to work of that exacting kind. Even with the help of Penrose to encourage him, he does not get on to his satisfaction. And yet, as I could plainly perceive, the ambition to make a name in the world exercises a stronger influence over him than ever. All in our favor, my reverend friend, all in our favor. I took the liberty of asking to see Penrose alone for a moment, and, this request granted, Romayne and I parted cordially. I can make most people like me when I choose to try. The master of Vange Abbey is no exception to the rule. Did I tell you, by the by, that the property has a little declined of late in value? It's now not worth more than $6,000 a year. We will improve it when it returns to the church. My interview with Penrose was over in 2 minutes. Dispensing with formality, I took his arm and led him into the front garden. "I have heard all about it," I said, "and I must not deny that you have disappointed me. But I know your disposition, and I make allowances. You have qualities, dear Arthur, which perhaps put you a little out of place among us. I shall be obliged to report what you have done, but you may trust me to put it favorably. Shake hands, my son, while we are still together. Let us be as good friends as ever." You may think that I spoke in this way with a view to my indulgent language being repeated to Romayne, and so improving the position which I have already gained in his estimation. Do you know, I really believe I meant it at the time. The poor fellow gratefully kissed my hand when I offered it to him. He was not able to speak. I wonder whether I am weak about Arthur. say a kind word for him when his conduct comes under notice. But pray don't mention this little frailty of mine, and don't suppose I have any sympathy with his weak-minded submission to Mrs. Romayne's prejudices. If I ever felt the smallest consideration for her, and I cannot call to mind any amiable emotion of that sort, her letter to Winterfield would have effectually extinguished it. There's something quite revolting to me in a deceitful woman. In closing this letter, I may quiet the minds of our reverend brethren if I assure them that my former objection to associating myself directly with the conversion of Romayne no longer exists. Yes, even at my age, and with my habits, I am now resigned to hearing and confuting the trivial arguments of a man who is young enough to be my son. I shall write a carefully guarded letter to Romayne in the departure of Penrose, and I shall send him a book to read, from the influence of which I expect gratifying results. It's not a controversial work. Arthur has been beforehand with me there. It is Wiseman's Recollections of Popes. I look to that essentially readable book to excite Romayne's imagination by vivid descriptions of the splendors of the Church and the vast influence and power of the higher priesthood. Does this sudden enthusiasm of mine surprise you? And are you altogether at a loss to know what it means? It means, my friend, that I see our position towards Romayne in a new light. Forgive me if I say no more for the present. I prefer to be silent until my audacity is justified by events. End of Book 4, Chapter 4. Recording by Sandra Estenson. Chapter 5. The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Estenson. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. Book 4, Chapter 5. Bernard Winterfield's Correspondence. From Mrs. Romayne to Mr. Winterfield. Has my letter failed to reach you? I directed it, as I direct this, to Bow Park, not knowing your London address. Yesterday, Father Benwell called at 10 Acres Lodge. He first saw my mother and myself, and he contrived to mention your name. It was done with his usual adroitness, and I might perhaps have passed over it if he had not looked at me. I hope and pray it may be only my fancy, but I thought I saw in his eyes that he was conscious of having me in his power, and that he might betray me to my husband at any moment. I have no sort of claim on you, and heaven knows I have little reason to trust you, but I thought you meant fairly by me when we spoke together at this house. In that belief, I entreat you to tell me if Father Benwell has intruded himself into your confidence, or even if you have hinted anything to him which gives him a hold over me. 2. From Mr. Winterfield to Mrs. Romayne. Both your letters have reached me. I have good reason for believing that you are entirely mistaken in your estimate of Father Benwell's character, but I know by sad experience how you hold to your opinions when they are once formed, and I am eager to relieve you of all anxiety. So far as I am concerned, I have not said one word. I have not even let slip the slightest hint which could inform Father Benwell of the past event in our lives to which your letter alludes. Your secret is a sacred secret to me, and it has been and shall be sacredly kept. There's a sentence in your letter which has given me great pain. You reiterate the cruel language of the bygone time. You say, "Heaven knows I have little reason to trust you." I have reasons on my side for not justifying myself, except under certain conditions. I mean under conditions which might place me in a position to serve and advise you as a friend or brother. In that case, I undertake to prove even to you that it was a cruel injustice ever to have doubted me, and there is no man living whom you can more implicitly trust than myself. My address when I am in London is at the head of this page. 3. From Dr. Wybrow to Mr. Winterfield. Dear Sir, I have received your letter mentioning that you wish to accompany me at my next visit to the asylum to see the French boy, so strangely associated with the papers delivered to you by Father Benwell. Your proposal reaches me too late. The poor creature's troubled life has come to an end. He never rallied from the exhausting effect of the fever. To the last he was attended by his mother. I write with true sympathy for that excellent lady, but I cannot conceal from you or from myself that this death is not to be regretted. In a case of the same extraordinary kind, recorded in print, the patient recovered from the fever, and his insanity returned with his returning health. Faithfully yours, Joseph Wybrow. End of Book 4, Chapter 5. Recording by Sandra Estenson. 4, Chapter 6 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Estenson. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. Book 4, Chapter 6. The Saddest of All Words. On the 10th morning, dating from the dispatch of Father Benwell's last letter to Rome, Penrose was writing in the study at 10 Acres Lodge, while Romayne sat at the other end of the room, looking listlessly at a blank sheet of paper with the pen lying idle beside it. On a sudden he rose, and snatching up paper and pen, threw them irritably into the fire. "Don't trouble yourself to write any longer," he said to Penrose. "My dream is over. Throw my manuscripts into the waste-paper basket, and never speak to me of literary work again." "Every man devoted to literature has these fits of despondency," Penrose answered. "Don't think of your work. Send for your horse, and trust to fresh air and exercise to relieve your mind." Romayne barely listened. He turned round at the fireplace and studied the reflection of his face in the glass. "I look worse and worse," he said thoughtfully to himself. It was true. His flesh had fallen away. His face had withered and whitened. He stooped like an old man. The change for the worse had been steadily proceeding from the time when he left Vange Abbey. "It's useless to conceal it from me," he burst out, turning toward Penrose. "I believe I am in some way answerable, though you all deny it, for the French boy's death. Why not? His voice still in my ears, and the stain of his brother's blood is on me. I'm under a spell. Do you believe in the witches, the merciless old women who made wax images of the people who injured them, and stuck pins in their mock likenesses to register the slow wasting away of their victims day after day? People disbelieve in it these times, but it has never been disproved." He stopped, looked at Penrose, and suddenly changed his tone. "Arthur, what is the matter with you? Have you had a bad night? Has anything happened?" For the first time in Romayne's experience of him, Penrose answered evasively. "There's nothing to make me anxious," he said. "When I hear you talk as you're talking now, the poor French boy died of fever. Must I remind you again that he owed the happiest days of his life to you and your good wife?" Romayne still looked at him without attending to what he said. "Surely you don't think I am deceiving you?" Penrose remonstrated. "No. I was thinking of something else. I was wondering whether I really know you as well as I thought I did. Am I mistaken in supposing that you are not an ambitious man?" "My only ambition is to lead a worthy life and to be as useful to my fellow creatures as I can. Does that satisfy you?" Romayne hesitated. "It seems strange," he began. "What seems strange?" "I don't say it seems strange that you should be a priest," Romayne explained. "I'm only surprised that a man of your simple way of thinking should have attached himself to the order of Jesuits." "I can quite understand that," said Penrose. "But you should remember that circumstances often influence a man in his choice of a vocation. It has been so with me. I am a member of a Roman Catholic family. A Jesuit college was near our place of abode, and a near relative of mine, since dead, was one of the resident priests." He paused and added in a lower tone, "When I was a little more than a lad, I suffered a disappointment which altered my character for life. I took refuge in the college, and I have found patience and peace of mind since that time." "Oh, my friend, you might have been more a contented man." He stopped again. His interest in the husband had all but deceived him into forgetting his promise to the wife. Romayne held out his hand. "I hope I have not thoughtlessly hurt you," he said. Penrose took the offered hand and pressed it fervently. He tried to speak, and suddenly shuddered, like a man in pain. "I'm not very well this morning," he stammered. "A turn in the garden will do me good." Romayne's doubts were confirmed by the manner in which Penrose left him. Something had unquestionably happened which his friend shrank from communicating to him. He sat down again at his desk and tried to read. The time passed, and he was still left alone. When the door was at last opened, it was only Stella who entered the room. "Have you seen Penrose?" he asked. The estrangement between them had been steadily widening of late. Romayne had expressed his resentment at his wife's interference between Penrose and himself by that air of contemptuous endurance which is the hardest penalty that a man can inflict on the woman who loves him. Stella had submitted with a proud and silent resignation, the most unfortunate form of protest that she could have adopted toward a man of Romayne's temper. When she now appeared, however, in her husband's study, there was a change in her expression which he instantly noticed. She looked at him with eyes softened by sorrow. Before she could answer his first question, he hurriedly added another. "Is Penrose really ill?" "No, Lewis. He is distressed." "About what?" "About you and about himself." "Is he going to leave us?" "Yes." "But will he come back again?" Stella took a chair by her husband's side. "I'm truly sorry for you, Lewis," she said. "It is even a sad parting for me. If you will let me say it, I have a sincere regard for dear Mr. Penrose." Under the circumstances, this confession of feeling for the man who had sacrificed his dearest aspiration to the one consideration of her happiness might have provoked a sharp reply. But by this time Romayne had really become alarmed. "You speak as if Arthur was going to leave England," he said. "He leaves England this afternoon," she answered, "for Rome." "Why does he tell this to you and not to me?" Romayne asked. "He cannot trust himself to speak to you. He begged me to prepare you." Her courage failed her. She paused. Romayne beat his hand impatiently on the desk before him. "Speak out!" he cried. "If Rome is not the end of the journey, What is?" Stella hesitated no longer. "He goes to Rome," she said, "to receive his instructions and to become personally acquainted with the missionaries who are associated with him. They will leave Leghorn in the next vessel which sets sail for a port in Central America, and the dangerous duty intrusted to them is to re-establish one of the Jesuit missions destroyed by the savages years since. They will find their church a ruin, and not a vestige left of the house once inhabited by the murdered priests. It is not concealed from them that they may be martyred too. They are soldiers of the cross, and they go, willingly go, to save the souls of the Indians at peril of their lives." Romayne rose and advanced to the door. There he turned and spoke to Stella. "Where is Arthur?" he said. Stella gently detained him. "There was a word more he entreated me to say. Pray wait and hear it," she pleaded. "His one grief is at leaving you. Apart from that, he devotes himself gladly to the dreadful service which claims him. He has long looked forward to it, and has long prepared himself for it. Those, Lewis, are his own words." There was a knock at the door. The servant appeared to announce that the carriage was waiting. Penrose entered the room as the man left it. "Have you spoken for me?" he said to Stella. She could only answer him by a gesture. He turned to Romayne with a faint smile. "The saddest of all words must be spoken," he said. "Farewell." Pale and trembling, Romayne took his hand. "Is this Father Benwell's doing?" he asked. "No," Penrose answered firmly. "In Father Benwell's position it might have been his doing, but for his goodness to me. For the first time since I have known him, he has shrunk from a responsibility. For my sake, he has left it to Rome, and Rome has spoken. Oh, my more than friend, my brother in love!" His voice failed him. With a resolution which was nothing less than heroic in a man of his affectionate nature, he recovered his composure. "Let us make it as little miserable as it can be," he said. "At every opportunity we will write to each other, and who knows? I may yet come back to you. God has preserved his servants in dangers as great as any that I shall encounter. May that merciful God bless and protect you. Oh, Romayne, what happy days we have had together!" His last powers of resistance were worn out. Tears of noble sorrow dimmed the friendly eyes which had never once looked unkindly on the brother of his love. He kissed Romayne. "Help me out," he said, turning blindly toward the hall, in which the servant was waiting. That last act of mercy was not left to the servant. With sisterly tenderness, Stella took his hand and led him away. "I shall remember you gratefully as long as I live," she said to him when the carriage door closed. He waved his hand at the window, and she saw him no more. She returned to the study. The relief of tears had not come to Romayne. He had dropped into a chair when Penrose left him. In stony silence he sat there, head down, his eyes dry and staring. The miserable days of their estrangement were forgotten by his wife in the moment when she looked at him. She knelt by his side and lifted his head a little and laid it on her bosom. Her heart was full. She let the caress plead for her silently. He felt it. His cold fingers pressed her hand thankfully, but he said nothing. After a long interval, the first outward expression of sorrow that fell from his lips showed that he was still thinking of Penrose. "Every blessing falls away from me," he said. "I have lost my best friend. Years afterward, Stella remembered those words and the tone in which he had spoken them. End of Book 4, Chapter 6. Or Chapter 7 of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Estenson. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. Book 4, Chapter 7. The Impulsive Sex. After a lapse of a few days, Father Benwell was again a visitor at 10 Acres Lodge, by Romayne's invitation. The priest occupied the very chair by the study fireside in which Penrose had been accustomed to sit. "It is really kind of you to come to me," said Romayne, "so soon after receiving my acknowledgment of your letter. I can't tell you how I was touched by the manner in which you wrote of Penrose. To my shame, I must confess, I had no idea that you were so warmly attached to him." "I hardly knew it myself, Mr. Romayne, until our dear Arthur was taken away from us." "If you used your influence, Father Benwell, is there no hope that you might yet persuade him—" "To withdraw from the mission? Oh, Mr. Romayne, don't you know Arthur's character better than that? Even his gentle temper has its resolute side. The zeal of the first martyrs to Christianity is the zeal that burns in that noble nature. The mission has been the dream of his life. It is endeared to him by the very dangers which we dread. Persuade Arthur to desert the dear and devoted colleagues who have opened their arms to him? I might as soon persuade that statue in the garden to desert its pedestal and join us in this room. Shall we change the sad subject? Have you received the book which I sent you with my letter?" Romayne took up the book from his desk. Before he could speak of it, someone called out briskly on the other side of the door, "May I come in?" and came in, without waiting to be asked. Mrs. Eyrecourt, painted and robed for the morning, wafting perfumes as she moved, appeared in the study. She looked at the priest and lifted her many-ringed hands with a gesture of coquettish terror. "Oh, dear me! I had no idea you were here, Father Benwell. I ask 10,000 pardons. Dear and admirable Romayne, don't look as if you were pleased to see me. Good gracious! I am not interrupting a confession, am I?" Father Benwell, with his paternal smile in perfect order, resigned his chair to Mrs. Eyrecourt. The traces of her illness still showed themselves in an intermittent trembling of her head and her hands. She had entered the room, strongly suspecting that the process of conversion might be proceeding in the absence of Penrose, and determined to interrupt it. Guided by his subtle intelligence, Father Benwell penetrated her motive as soon as she opened the door. Mrs. Eyrecourt bowed graciously and took the offered chair. Father Benwell sweetened his paternal smile and offered to get a footstool. "How glad I am," he said, "to see you in your customary good spirits. But wasn't it just a little malicious to talk of interrupting a confession? As if Mr. Romayne was one of us! Queen Elizabeth herself could hardly have said a sharper thing to a poor Catholic priest." "You clever creature," said Mrs. Eyrecourt. "How easily you see through a simple woman like me. There, I will give you my hand to kiss, and I will never try to deceive you again. Do you know, Father Benwell, a most extraordinary wish has suddenly come to me. Please don't be offended. I wish you were a Jew." "May I ask why?" Father Benwell inquired, with an apostolic suavity worthy of the best days of Rome. Mrs. Eyrecourt explained herself with the modest self-distrust of a maiden of 15. "I'm really so ignorant I hardly know how to put it, but learned persons have told me that it is the peculiarity of the Jews, may I say the amiable peculiarity, never to make converts. It would be so nice if you would take a leaf out of their book when we have the happiness of receiving you here. My lively imagination pictures you in a double character, Father Benwell everywhere else, and, say, the patriarch Abraham at 10 Acres Lodge." Father Benwell lifted his persuasive hands in courteous protest. "My dear lady, pray make your mind easy. Not one word on the subject of religion has passed between Mr. Romayne and myself." "I beg your pardon," Mrs. Eyrecourt interposed. "I am afraid I fail to follow you. My silent son in law looks as if he longed to smother me, and my attention is naturally distracted. You were about to say—" "I was about to say, dear Mrs. Eyrecourt, that you are alarming yourself without any reason. Not one word on any controversial subject has passed." Mrs. Eyrecourt cocked her head with the artless vivacity of a bird. "Ah, but it might, though," she suggested slyly. Father Benwell once more remonstrated in dumb show, and Romayne lost his temper. "Mrs. Eyrecourt!" he cried sternly. Mrs. Eyrecourt screamed and lifted her hands to her ears. "I'm not deaf, dear Romayne, and I'm not to be put down by any ill-timed exhibition of what I may call domestic ferocity. Father Benwell sets you an example of Christian moderation. Please do follow it." Romayne refused to follow it. "Talk on any other topic that you like, Mrs. Eyrecourt. I request you don't oblige me to use a harder word. I request you to spare Father Benwell and myself any further expression of your opinion on controversial subjects. A son-in-law may make a request, and a mother-in-law may decline to comply. Mrs. Eyrecourt declined to comply. No, Romayne, it won't do. I may lament your unhappy temper for my daughter's sake, but I know what I am about, and you can't provoke me. Our reverend friend and I understand each other. He will make allowances for a sensitive woman who has had sad experience of conversions in her own household. My eldest daughter, Father Benwell, a poor foolish creature, was converted into a nunnery. The last time I saw her, she used to be sweetly pretty, my dear husband quite adored her. The last time I saw her, she had a red nose, and what is even more revolting at her age, a double chin. She received me with her lips pursed up and her eyes on the ground, and she was insolent enough to say that she would pray for me. I am not a furious old man with a long white beard, and I don't curse my daughter and rush out into a thunderstorm afterward. But I know what King Lear felt, and I have struggled with hysterics just as he did. With your wonderful insight into human nature, I am sure you will sympathize with and forgive me. Mr. Penrose, as my daughter tells me, behaved in the most gentleman-like manner. I make the same appeal to your kind forbearance. The bare prospect of our dear friend here becoming a Catholic—" Romayne's temper gave way once more. "If anything can make me a Catholic," he said, "your interference will do it." "Out of sheer perversity, dear Romayne?" "Not at all, Mrs. Eyrecourt. If I become a Catholic, I might escape from the society of ladies in the refuge of the monastery." Mrs. Eyrecourt hit him back with the readiest dexterity. "Remain a Protestant, my dear, and go to your club. There is a refuge for you from the ladies, a monastery with nice little diners and all the newspapers and periodicals." Having launched this shaft, she got up and recovered her easy courtesy of look and manner. "I'm so much obliged to you, Father Benwell. I have not offended you, I hope and trust." "You have done me a service, dear Mrs. Eyrecourt. But for your salutary caution, I might have drifted into controversial subjects. I shall be on my guard now." "How very good of you. We shall meet again, I hope, under more agreeable circumstances." After that polite allusion to the monastery, I understand that my visit to my son-in-law may as well come to an end. Please don't forget 5 o'clock tea at my house. As she approached the door, it was opened from the outer side. Her daughter met her halfway. "Why are you here, mamma?" Stella asked. "Why, indeed, my love, you had better leave the room with me. Our amiable Romayne's present idea is to relieve himself of our society by retiring to the monastery. Don't you see, Father Benwell?" Stella coldly returned the priest's bow, and looked at Romayne. She felt a vague forewarning of what had happened. Mrs. Eyrecourt proceeded to enlighten her as an appropriate expression of gratitude. "We are indeed indebted to Father Benwell, my dear. He has been most considerate and kind." Romayne interrupted her without ceremony. "Favor me," he said, addressing his wife, "by inducing Mrs. Eyrecourt to continue her narrative in some other room." Stella was hardly conscious of what her mother or her husband had said. She felt that the priest's eyes were on her. Under any other circumstances, Father Benwell's good breeding and knowledge of the world would have impelled him to take his departure. As things were, he knew perfectly well that the more seriously Romayne was annoyed in his presence, the better his own private interests would be served. Accordingly, he stood apart, silently observant of Stella. In spite of Winterfield's reassuring reply to her letter, Stella instinctively suspected and dreaded the Jesuit. Under the spell of those watchful eyes, she trembled inwardly. Her customary tact deserted her. She made an indirect apology to the man whom she hated and feared. "Whatever my mother may have said to you, Father Benwell, has been without my knowledge." Romayne attempted to speak, but Father Benwell was too quick for him. "Dear Mrs. Romayne, nothing has been said which needs any disclaimer on your part." "I should think not," Mrs. Eyrecourt added. "Really, Stella, I don't understand you. Why may I not say to Father Benwell what you said to Mr. Penrose? You trusted Mr. Penrose as your friend. I can tell you this, I am quite sure you may trust Father Benwell." And once more Romayne attempted to speak, and once more Father Benwell was beforehand with him. "May I hope," said the priest, with a finely ironical smile, "that Mrs. Romayne agrees with her excellent mother?" With all her fear of him, the exasperating influence of his tone and his look was more than Stella could endure. Before she could restrain them, the rash words flew out of her lips. "I am not sufficiently well acquainted with you, Father Benwell, to express an opinion." With that answer, she took her mother's arm and left the room. The moment they were alone, Romayne turned to the priest, trembling with anger. Father Benwell, smiling indulgently at the lady's little outbreak, took him by the hand, with peacemaking intentions. "Now, pray don't excite yourself." Romayne was not to be pacified in that way. His anger was terribly intensified by the long continued strain on his nerves of the effort to control himself. "I must and will speak out at last," he said. "Father Benwell, the ladies of my household have inexcusably presumed on the consideration which is due to women. No words can say how ashamed I am of what has happened. I can only appeal to your admirable moderation and patience to accept my apologies and the most sincere expression of my regret. No more, Mr. Romayne. As a favor to me, I beg and entreat you will say no more. Sit down and compose yourself." But Romayne was impenetrable to the influence of friendly and forgiving demonstrations. "I can never expect you to enter my house again," he exclaimed. "My dear sir, I will come and see you again, with the greatest pleasure, on any day that you may appoint. The earlier day the better. Come, come, let us laugh. I don't say it disrespectfully, but poor dear Mrs. Eyrecourt has been more amusing than ever. I expect to see our excellent Archbishop to morrow, and I must really tell him how the good lady felt insulted when her Catholic daughter offered to pray for her. There's hardly anything more humorous, even in Moliere. And the double chin and the red nose, all the fault of those dreadful Papists. Oh, dear me, you still take it seriously. How I wish you had my sense of humor. When shall I come again, and tell you how the Archbishop likes the story of the nun's mother?" He held out his hand with irresistible cordiality. Romayne took it gratefully, still bent, however, on making atonement. "Let me first do myself the honor of calling on you," he said. "I am in no state to open my mind as I might have wished to open it to you after what has happened. In a day or two more—" "Say the day after to morrow," Father Benwell hospitably suggested. "Do me a great favor. Come and eat your bit of mutton at my lodgings. 6 o'clock, if you like, and some remarkably good claret, a present from one of the faithful. You will? That's hearty. And do promise me to think no more of our little domestic comedy. Relieve your mind. Look at Wiseman's Recollections of the Popes. Good bye. God bless you." The servant who opened the house door for Father Benwell was agreeably surprised by the Papist's cheerfulness. "He isn't half a bad fellow," the man announced among his colleagues. "Give me half a crown, and went out humming a tune." End of Book 4, Chapter 7.
Of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Moilinger. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. Book 4, Chapter 8. Father Benwell's Correspondence. To the Secretary, S. J., Rome. 1. I beg to acknowledge the receipt of your letter. You mention that our Reverend Fathers are discouraged at not having heard from me for more than 6 weeks, since I reported the little dinner given to Romayne at my lodgings. I am sorry for this, and more than sorry to hear that my venerated brethren are beginning to despair of Romayne's conversion. Grant me a delay of another week, and, if the prospects of the conversion are not sensibly improved in that time, I will confess myself defeated. Meanwhile, I bow to your superior wisdom, without venturing to add a word in my own defense. 2. The week's grace granted to me has elapsed. I write with humility. At the same time, I have something to say for myself. Yesterday, Mr. Lewis Romayne, of Vange Abbey, was received into the community of the Holy Catholic Church. I enclose an accurate newspaper report of the ceremonies which attended the conversion. Be pleased to inform me, by telegraph, whether our Reverend Fathers wish me to go on or not. End of Chapter 8. End of Book 4.
Chapter 1 of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Len Nicholson. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. Book the 5th. Chapter 1. Mrs. Eyrecourt's Discovery. The leaves had fallen in the grounds at 10 Acres Lodge, and stormy winds told drearily that winter had come. An unchanging dullness pervaded the house. Romayne was constantly absent in London, attending to his new religious duties under the guidance of Father Benwell. The litter of books and manuscripts in the study were seen no more. Hideously rigid order reigned in the unused room. Some of Romayne's papers had been burned. Others were imprisoned in drawers and cupboards. The history of the origin of religions had taken its melancholy place among the suspended literary enterprises of the time. Mrs. Eyrecourt, after a superficially cordial reconciliation with her son-in-law, visited her daughter every now and then, as an act of maternal sacrifice. She yawned perpetually. She read innumerable novels. She corresponded with her friends. In the long dull evenings the once lively lady sometimes openly regretted that she had not been born a man, with the three masculine resources of smoking, drinking, and swearing placed at her disposal. It was a dreary existence, and happier influences seemed but little likely to change it. Grateful as she was to her mother, no persuasion would induce Stella to leave 10 Acres and amuse herself in London. Mrs. Eyrecourt said, with melancholy and metaphorical truth, "There is no elasticity left in my child." On a dim grey morning, mother and daughter sat by the fireside, with another long day before them. "Where is that contemptible husband of yours?" Mrs. Eyrecourt asked, looking up from her book. "Lewis is staying in town," Stella answered listlessly. "In company with Judas Iscariot?" Stella was too dull to immediately understand the allusion. "Do you mean Father Benwell?" she inquired. "Don't mention his name, my dear. I have rechristened him on purpose to avoid it. Even his name humiliates me. How completely the fawning old wretch took me in, with all my knowledge of the world, too. He was so nice and sympathetic. Such a comforting contrast on that occasion to you and your husband. I declare I forgot every reason I had for not trusting him. Ah, we women are poor creatures. We may own it among ourselves. If a man only has nice manners and a pleasant voice, how many of us can resist him? Even Romayne imposed upon me, assisted by his property, which in some degree excuses my folly. There is nothing to be done now, Stella, but to humour him. Do as that detestable priest does, and trust to your beauty. There isn't as much of it left as I could wish, to turn the scale in your favour. Have you any idea when the new convert will come back? I heard him ordering a fish dinner for himself yesterday, because it was Friday. Did you join him at dessert time, profanely supported by meat? What did he say?" "What he has said more than once already, mamma. His peace of mind is returning, thanks to Father Benwell. He was perfectly gentle and indulgent, but he looked as if he lived in a different world from mine. He told me he proposed to pass a week in what he called retreat. I didn't ask him what it meant. Whatever it is, I suppose he is there now." "My dear, don't you remember your sister began in the same way? She retreated. We shall have Romayne with a red nose and a double chin offering to pray for us next. Do you recollect that French maid of mine, the woman I sent away because she would spit when she was out of temper, like a cat? I begin to think I treated the poor creature harshly. When I hear of Romayne and his retreat, I almost feel inclined to spit myself. There! Let us go on with your reading. Take the first volume. I have done with it." "What is it, mamma?" "A very remarkable work, Stella, in the present state of light literature in England. A novel that actually tells a story. It's quite incredible, I know. Try the book. It is another extraordinary merit. It isn't written by a woman." Stella obediently received the first volume, turned over the leaves, and wearily dropped the wonderful novel on her lap. "I can't attend to it," she said. "My mind is too full of my own thoughts." "About Romayne?" said her mother. "No. When I think of my husband now, I almost wish I had his confidence in priests and retreats. The conviction grows on me, mamma, that my worst troubles are still to come. When I was younger, I don't remember being tormented by presentiments of any kind. Did I ever talk of presentiments to you in the bygone days? If you had done anything of the sort, my love, excuse me if I speak plainly, I should have said, 'Stella, your liver is out of order,' and I should have opened the family medicine chest. I will only say now, send for the carriage. Let us go to a morning concert, dine at a restaurant, and finish the evening at the play." This characteristic proposal was entirely thrown away in Stella. She was absorbed in pursuing her own train of thought. "I almost wish I had told Lewis," she said to herself absently. "Told him of what, my dear?" "Of what happened to me with Winterfield." Mrs. Eyrecourt's faded eyes opened wide in astonishment. "Do you really mean it?" she asked. "I do indeed." "Are you actually simple enough, Stella, to think that a man of Romayne's temper would have made you his wife if you had told him of the Brussels marriage?" "Why not?" "Why not? Would Romayne, would any man, believe that you really did part from Winterfield at the church door? Considering that you are a married woman, your innocence, my sweet child, is a perfect phenomenon. It's well there are wiser people than you to keep your secret." "Don't speak too positively, mamma. Lewis may find it out yet." "Is that one of your presentiments?" "Yes." "How is he to find it out, if you please?" "I am afraid through Father Benwell." "Yes, yes, I know you only think him a fawning old hypocrite. You don't fear him as I do. Nothing will persuade me that zeal for his religion is the motive under which that man acts in devoting himself to Romayne. He has some abominable object in view, and his eyes tell me that I am concerned in it." Mrs. Eyrecourt burst out laughing. "What is there to laugh at?" Stella asked. "I declare, my dear, there is something absolutely provoking in your utter want of knowledge of the world. When you are puzzled to account for anything remarkable in a clergyman's conduct (I don't care, my poor child, to what denomination he belongs), you can't be wrong in attributing his motive to money. If Romayne had turned Baptist or Methodist, the reverend gentleman in charge of his spiritual welfare would not have forgotten, as you have forgotten, you little goose, that his convert was a rich man. His mind would have dwelt on the chapel, or the mission, or the infant school, in want of funds. And, with no more abominable object in view than I have, at this moment, in poking the fire, he would have ended in producing his modest subscription list, and would have betrayed himself, just as our odious Benwell will betray himself, by the two amiable words, 'Please contribute.' Is there any other presentiment, my dear, on which you would like to have your mother's candid opinion?" Stella resignedly took up the book again. "I dare say you are right," she said. "Let us read our novel." Before she had reached the end of the first page, her mind was far away again from the unfortunate story. She was thinking of that other presentiment which had formed the subject of her mother's last satirical inquiry. The vague fear that had shaken her when she had accidentally touched the French boy on her visit to Camp's Hill still from time to time troubled her memory. Even the event of his death had failed to dissipate the delusion which associated him with some undefined evil influence that might yet assert itself. The superstitious forewarning of this sort was a weakness new to her in her experience of herself. She was heartily ashamed of it, and yet it kept its hold. Once more the book dropped on her lap. She laid it aside and walked wearily to the window to look at the weather. Almost at the same moment Mrs. Eyrecourt's maid disturbed her mistress over the second volume of the novel by entering the room with a letter. "For me?" Stella asked, looking round from the window. "No, ma'am, for Mrs. Eyrecourt." The letter had been brought to the house by one of Lady Loring's servants. In delivering it, he had apparently given private instructions to the maid. She laid her finger significantly on her lips when she gave the letter to her mistress. In these terms Lady Loring wrote: "If Stella happens to be with you when you receive my note, don't say anything which will let her know that I am your correspondent. She has always, poor dear, had an inveterate distrust of Father Benwell, and between ourselves I am not sure that she is quite so foolish as I once thought. The father has unexpectedly left us, with a well-framed excuse which satisfied Lord Loring. It fails to satisfy me, not from any wonderful exercise of penetration on my part, but in consequence of something I have just heard in course of conversation with a Catholic friend. Father Benwell, my dear, turns out to be a Jesuit, and what is more, a person of such high authority in the order that his concealment of his rank while he was with us must have been a matter of necessity. He must have had some very serious motive for occupying a position so entirely beneath him as his position in our house. I have not the shadow of a reason for associating the startling discovery with dear Stella's painful misgivings, and yet there is something in my mind which makes me want to hear what Stella's mother thinks. Come and have a talk about it as soon as you possibly can." Mrs. Eyrecourt put the letter in her pocket, smiling quietly to herself. Applying to Lady Loring's letter the infallible system of solution which she had revealed to her daughter, Mrs. Eyrecourt solved the mystery of the priest's conduct without a moment's hesitation. Lord Loring's cheque in Father Benwell's pocket representing such a liberal subscription that my lord was reluctant to mention it to my lady. There was the reading of the riddle, as plain as the sun at noonday. Would it be desirable to enlighten Lady Loring as she had already enlightened Stella? Mrs. Eyrecourt decided in a negative. As Roman Catholics and as old friends of Romayne, the Lorings naturally rejoiced in his conversion. But as old friends also of Romayne's wife, they were bound not to express their sentiments too openly. Feeling that any discussion of the priest's motives would probably lead to the delicate subject of the conversion, Mrs. Eyrecourt prudently determined to let the matter drop. As a consequence of this decision, Stella was left without the slightest warning of the catastrophe which was now close at hand. Mrs. Eyrecourt joined her daughter at the window. "Well, my dear, is it clearing up? Shall we take a drive before luncheon?" "If you like, mamma." She turned to her mother as she answered. The light of the clearing sky, at once soft and penetrating, fell full on her. Mrs. Eyrecourt, looking at her as usual, suddenly became serious. She studied her daughter's face with an eager and attentive scrutiny. "Do you see any extraordinary change in me?" Stella asked with a faint smile. Instead of answering, Mrs. Eyrecourt put her arm round Stella with a loving gentleness, entirely at variance with any ordinary expression of her character. The worldly mother's eyes rested with a lingering tenderness on the daughter's face. "Stella," she said softly, and stopped, at a loss for words for the first time in her life. After a while she began again. "Yes, I see a change in you," she whispered. "An interesting change, which tells me something. Can you guess what it is?" Stella's colour rose brightly, and faded again. She laid her head in silence on her mother's bosom. Worldly, frivolous, self-interested, Mrs. Eyrecourt's nature was the nature of a woman, and the one great trial and triumph of a woman's life, appealing to her as a trial and a triumph soon to come to her own child, touched fibres under the hardened surface of her heart which were still unprofaned. "My poor darling," she said, "have you told the good news to your husband?" "No." "Why not?" "He doesn't care now for anything that I can tell him." "Nonsense, Stella. You may win him back to you by a word. And do you hesitate to say the word?" "I shall tell him." Stella suddenly drew herself away from her mother's caressing arm. "If you do," she cried, "no words can say how inconsiderate and how cruel I shall think you. Promise, on your word of honour, promise you will leave it to me." "Will you tell him yourself if I leave it to you?" "Yes, at my own time." "Promise." "Hush, hush. Don't excite yourself, my love. I promise. Give me a kiss. I declare I am agitated myself," she exclaimed, falling back into her customary manner. "Such a shock to my vanity, Stella, the prospect of becoming a grandmother. I really must ring for Matilda and take a few drops of red lavender. Be advised by me, my poor dear, and we will turn the priest out of the house yet. When Romayne comes back from his ridiculous retreat, after his fasting and flagellation and heaven knows what besides, then bring him to his senses. Then is the time to tell him. Will you think of it?" "Yes, I will think of it." "And one word more, before Matilda comes in. Remember the vast importance of having a male heir to Vange Abbey. On these occasions you may practice with perfect impunity on the ignorance of the men. Tell him you're sure it's going to be a boy." End of Chapter 1. The 5th, Chapter 2 of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Len Nicholson. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. Book the 5th, Chapter 2, The Seed is Sown. Situated in a distant quarter of the vast western suburb of London, the house called the Retreat stood in the midst of a well-kept garden, protected on all sides by a high brick wall. Excepting the grand gilt cross on the roof of the chapel, nothing revealed externally the devotional purpose to which the Roman Catholic priesthood, assisted by the liberality of the faithful, had dedicated the building. But the convert privileged to pass the gates left Protestant England outside, and found himself, as it were, in a new country. Inside the Retreat, the paternal care of the Church took possession of him, surrounded him with monastic simplicity in his neat little bedroom, and dazzled him with devotional splendour when his religious duties called him into the chapel. The perfect taste, so seldom found in the modern arrangement and decoration of convents and churches in southern countries, showed itself here, pressed into the service of religion in every part of the house. The severest discipline had no sordid and hideous side to it in the Retreat. The inmates fasted on spotless tablecloths, and handled knives and forks, the humble servants of half-filled stomachs, without a speck on their decent brightness. Penitents who kissed the steps of the altar, to use the expressive Oriental phrase, eat no dirt. Friends, liberal friends, permitted to visit the inmates on stated days, saw copies of famous Holy Families in the reception-room, which were really works of art, and trod on a carpet of studiously modest pretensions, exhibiting pious emblems beyond reproach in colour and design. The Retreat had its own artesian well. Not a person in the house drank impurity in his water. A faint perfume of incense was perceptible in the corridors. The soothing and mysterious silence of the place was intensified rather than disturbed by soft footsteps, and gentle opening and closing of doors. Animal life was not even represented by a cat in the kitchen, and yet, pervaded by some inscrutable influence, the house was not dull. Heretics, with lively imaginations, might have not inappropriately likened it to an enchanted castle. In one word, the Catholic system here showed to perfection its masterly knowledge of the weakness of human nature, and its inexhaustible dexterity in adapting the means to the end. On the morning when Mrs. Eyrecourt and her daughter held their memorable interview by the fireside at 10 Acres, Father Benwell entered one of the private rooms at the Retreat, devoted to the use of the priesthood. The demure attendant, waiting humbly for instructions, was sent to request the presence of one of the inmates of the house, named Mortalman. Father Benwell's customary serenity was a little ruffled on this occasion by an appearance of anxiety. More than once he looked impatiently toward the door, and he never even noticed the last new devotional publications laid invitingly on the table. Mr. Mortalman made his appearance, a young man and a promising convert. The wild brightness of his eyes revealed that incipient form of brain disease which begins in fanaticism and ends not infrequently in religious madness. His manner of greeting the priest was absolutely servile. He cringed before the illustrious Jesuit. Father Benwell took no notice of these demonstrations of humility. "Be seated, my son," he said. Mr. Mortalman looked as if he would have preferred going down on his knees, but he yielded and took a chair. "I think you have been Mr. Romayne's companion for a few days, in the hours of recreation," the priest began. "Yes, Father." "Does he appear to be at all weary of his residence in this house?" "Oh, far from it. He feels the benign influence of the Retreat. We have had some delightful hours together." "Have you anything to report?" Mr. Mortalman crossed his hands on his breast and bowed profoundly. "I have to report of myself, Father, that I have committed the sin of presumption. I presumed that Mr. Romayne was, like myself, not married. Have I spoken to you on that subject?" "No, Father." "Then you have committed no sin. You have only made an excusable mistake. How were you led into error?" "In this way, Father. Mr. Romayne had been speaking to me of a book which you had been so good as to send to him. He had been especially interested by the memoir therein contained of the illustrious Englishman, Cardinal Acton. The degrees by which his Eminence rose to the rank of a prince of the Church seemed, as I thought, to have aroused in my friend a new sense of vocation. He asked me if I myself aspired to belong to the holy priesthood. I answered that this was indeed my aspiration, if I might hope to be found worthy. He appeared to be deeply affected. I ventured to ask if he too had the same prospect before him. He grieved me indescribably. He sighed, and said, "I have no such hope. I am married." "Tell me, father, I entreat you, have I done wrong?" Father Benwell considered for a moment. "Did Mr. Romayne say anything more?" he asked. "No, father." "Did you attempt to return to the subject?" "I thought it best to be silent." Father Benwell held out his hand. "My young friend, you have not only done no wrong, you have shown the most commendable discretion. I will detain you no longer from your duties. Go to Mr. Romayne, and say that I wish to speak with him." Mr. Mortleman dropped on one knee, and begged for a blessing. Father Benwell lifted the traditional 2 fingers, and gave the blessing. The conditions of human happiness are easily fulfilled if we rightly understand them. Mr. Mortleman retired perfectly happy. Left by himself again, Father Benwell paced the room rapidly from end to end. The disturbing influence visible in his face had now changed from anxiety to excitement. "I'll try it to-day," he said to himself, and stopped and looked round him doubtfully. "No, not here," he decided. "It may get talked about too soon. It will be safer in every way at my lodgings." He recovered his composure and returned to his chair. Romayne opened the door. The double influence of the conversion and of the life in the retreat had already changed him. His customary keenness and excitability of look had subsided, and had left nothing in their place but an expression of suave and meditative repose. All his troubles were now in the hands of his priest. There was a passive regularity in his bodily movements, and a beatific serenity in his smile. "My dear friend," said Father Benwell, cordially shaking hands, "you were good enough to be guided by my advice in entering this house. Be guided by me again, when I say that you have been here long enough. You can return after an interval, if you wish it. But I have something to say to you first, and I beg to offer the hospitality of my lodgings." The time had been when Romayne would have asked for some explanation of this abrupt notice of removal. Now he passively accepted the advice of his spiritual director. Father Benwell made the necessary communication to the authorities, and Romayne took leave of his friends in the retreat. The great Jesuit and the great landowner left the place, with becoming humility, in a cab. "I hope I have not disappointed you," said Father Benwell. "I am only anxious," Romayne answered, "to hear what you have to say." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Len Nicholson. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. Book the 5th, Chapter 3, The Harvest is Reaped. On their way through the streets, Father Benwell talked as persistently of the news of the day as if he had nothing else in his thoughts. To keep his companion's mind in a state of suspense was, in certain emergencies, to exert a useful preparatory influence over a man of Romayne's character. Even when they reached his lodgings, the priest still hesitated to approach the object that he had in view. He made considerate inquiries in the character of a hospitable man. "They breakfast early at the retreat," he said. "What may I offer you?" "I want nothing, thank you," Romayne answered, with an effort to control his habitual impatience of needless delay. "Pardon me, we have a long interview before us, I fear. Our bodily necessities, Romayne, excuse me if I take the friendly liberty of suppressing the formal Mr. Our bodily necessities are not to be trifled with. A bottle of my famous claret and a few biscuits will not hurt either of us." He rang the bell and gave the necessary directions. "Another damp day," he went on cheerfully. "I hope you don't pay the rheumatic penalties of a winter residence in England. Ah, this glorious country would be too perfect if it possessed the delicious climate of Rome." The wine and biscuits were brought in. Father Benwell filled the glasses and bowed cordially to his guest. "Nothing of this sort at the retreat," he said gaily. "Excellent water, I am told, which is a luxury in its way, especially in London. Well, my dear Romayne, I must begin by making my apologies. You no doubt thought me a little abrupt in running away with you from your retirement at a moment's notice. I believed that you had good reasons, father, and that was enough for me. Thank you. You do me justice. It was in your best interests that I acted. There are men of phlegmatic temperament, over whom the wise monotony of discipline at the retreat exercises a wholesome influence. I mean an influence which may be prolonged with advantage. You are not one of these persons. Protracted seclusion and monotony of life are morally and mentally unprofitable to a man of your ardent disposition. I abstained from mentioning these reasons, at the time, out of a feeling of regard for our excellent resident director, who believes unreservedly in the institution over which he presides. Very good. The retreat has done all that it could usefully do in your case. We must think next of how to employ that mental activity which, rightly developed, is one of the most valuable qualities that you possess. Let me ask, first, if you have in some degree recovered your tranquillity. I feel like a different man, Father Benwell. That's right. And your nervous sufferings, I don't ask what they are. I only want to know if you experience a sense of relief. A most welcome sense of relief, Romayne answered, with a revival of the enthusiasm of other days. The complete change in all my thoughts and convictions which I owe to you, and to dear Penrose, Father Benwell interposed, with the prompt sense of justice which no man could more becomingly assume. We must not forget Arthur. Forget him? Romayne repeated. Not a day passes without my thinking of him. It is one of the happy results of the change in me that my mind does not dwell bitterly on the loss of him now. I think of Penrose with admiration, as of one whose glorious life, with all its dangers, I should like to share. He spoke with a rising colour and brightening eyes. Already the absorbent capacity of the Roman Church had drawn to itself that sympathetic side of his character, which was also one of its strongest sides. Already his love for Penrose, hitherto inspired by the virtues of the man, had narrowed its range to sympathy with the trials and privileges of the priest. Truly and deeply, indeed, had the physician consulted, in bygone days, reasoned on Romayne's case. That occurrence of some new and absorbing influence in his life, of which the doctor had spoken, that working of some complete change in his habits of thought, had found its way to him at last, after the wife's simple devotion had failed, through the subtler ministrations of the priest. Some men, having Father Benwell's object in view, would have taken instant advantage of the opening offered to them by Romayne's unguarded enthusiasm. The illustrious Jesuit held fast by the wise maxim which forbade him to do anything in a hurry. "No," he said, "your life must not be the life of our dear friend. The service on which the Church employs Penrose is not the fit service for you. You have other claims on us." Romayne looked at his spiritual adviser with a momentary change of expression, a relapse into the ironical bitterness of the past time. "Have you forgotten that I am and can be only a layman?" he asked. "What claims can I have except the common claim of all faithful members of the Church on the good offices of the priesthood?" He paused for a moment, and continued with the abruptness of a man struck by a new idea. "Yes, I have perhaps one small aim of my own, the claim of being allowed to do my duty." "In what respect, dear Romayne?" "Surely you can guess. I am a rich man. I have money lying idle, which it is my duty, and my privilege, to devote to the charities and necessities of the Church. And while I am speaking of this, I must own that I am a little surprised at your having said nothing to me on the subject. You have never yet pointed out to me the manner in which I might devote my money to the best and noblest uses. Was it forgetfulness on your part?" Father Benwell shook his head. "No," he replied, "I can't honestly say that." "Then you had a reason for your silence?" "Yes." "May I not know it?" Father Benwell got up and walked to the fireplace. Now, there are various methods of getting up and walking to a fireplace, and they find their way to outward expression through the customary means of look and manner. We may feel cold, and may only want to warm ourselves. Or we may feel restless, and may need an excuse for changing our position. Or we may feel modestly confused, and may be anxious to hide it. Father Benwell, from head to foot, expressed modest confusion, and polite anxiety to hide it. "My good friend," he said, "I am afraid of hurting your feelings." Romayne was a sincere convert, but there were instincts still left in him which resented this expression of regard, even when it proceeded from a man whom he respected and admired. "You will hurt my feelings," he answered, a little sharply, "if you are not plain with me." "Then I will be plain with you," Father Benwell rejoined. "The Church, speaking through me, as her unworthy interpreter, feels a certain delicacy in approaching you on the subject of money." "Why?" Father Benwell left the fireplace without immediately answering. He opened a drawer, and took out of it a flat mahogany box. His gracious familiarity became transformed, by some mysterious process of congelation, into a dignified formality of manner. The priest took the place of the man. "The Church, Mr. Romayne, hesitates to receive as benevolent contributions money derived from property of its own, arbitrarily taken from it and placed in a layman's hands." "No," he cried, interrupting Romayne, who instantly understood the allusion to Vange Abbey. "No, I must beg you to hear me out. I state the case plainly at your own request. At the same time, I am bound to admit that the lapse of centuries has in the eye of the law sanctioned the deliberate act of robbery perpetrated by Henry VIII. You have lawfully inherited Vange Abbey from your ancestors. The Church is not unreasonable enough to assert a merely moral right against the law of the country. It may feel the act of spoliation, but it submits." He unlocked the flat mahogany box, and gently dropped his dignity. The man took the place of the priest. "As the master of Vange," he said, "you may be interested in looking at a little historical curiosity which we have preserved. The title deeds, dear Romayne, by which the monks held your present property in their time. Take another glass of wine." Romayne looked at the title deeds, and laid them aside unread. Father Benwell had roused his pride, his sense of justice, his wild and lavish instincts of generosity. He who had always despised money, except when it assumed its only estimable character as a means for the attainment of merciful and noble ends, he was in possession of property to which he had no moral right, without even the poor excuse of associations which attached him to the place. "I hope I have not offended you," said Father Benwell. "You have made me ashamed of myself," Romayne answered warmly. "On the day when I became a Catholic, I ought to have remembered Vange. Better late than never. I refuse to take shelter under the law. I respect the moral right of the Church. I will at once restore the property which I have usurped." Father Benwell took both Romayne's hands in his, and pressed them fervently. "I am proud of you," he said. "We shall all be proud of you, when I write word to Rome of what has passed between us. But, no, Romayne, this must not be. I admire you, feel with you, and I refuse. On behalf of the Church, I say it. I refuse the gift." "Wait a little, Father Benwell. You don't know the state of my affairs. I don't deserve the admiration which you feel for me. The loss of the Vange property will be no pecuniary loss in my case. I have inherited a fortune from my aunt. My income from that source is far larger than my income from the Yorkshire property." "Romayne, it must not be." "Pardon me, it must be. I have more money than I can spend, without Vange, and I have painful associations with the house, which disincline me ever to enter it again." Even this confession failed to move Father Benwell. He obstinately crossed his arms, obstinately tapped his foot on the floor. "No," he said. "Plead as generously as you may, my answer is no." Romayne only became more resolute on his side. "The property is absolutely my own," he persisted. "I am without a near relation in the world. I have no children. My wife is already provided for at my death, out of the fortune left me by my aunt. It is downright obstinacy, forgive me for saying so, to persist in your refusal. It is downright duty, Romayne. If I gave way to you, I should be the means of exposing the priesthood to the vilest misinterpretation. I should be deservedly reprimanded, and your proposal of restitution, if you expressed it in writing, would, without a moment's hesitation, be torn up. If you have any regard for me, drop the subject." Romayne refused to yield even to this unanswerable appeal. "Very well," he said, "there is one document you can't tear up. You can't interfere with my making another will. I shall leave the Vange property to the Church, and I shall appoint you one of the trustees. You can't object to that." Father Benwell smiled sadly. "The law spares me the ungracious necessity of objecting in this case," he answered. "My friend, you forget the statutes of Mortmain. They positively forbid you to carry out the intention which you have just expressed." Romayne dismissed this appeal to the law irritably by waving his hand. "The statutes of Mortmain," he rejoined, "can't prevent my bequeathing my property to an individual. I shall leave Vange Abbey to you. Now, Father Benwell, have I got the better of you at last?" With Christian humility the Jesuit accepted the defeat, for which he had paved the way from the outset of the interview. At the same time, he shuffled all personal responsibility off his own shoulders. He had gained a victory for the Church, without, to do him justice, thinking of himself. "Your generosity has conquered me," he said, "but I must be allowed to clear myself of even the suspicion of an interested motive. On the day when your will is executed, I shall write to the General of our Order at Rome, leaving my inheritance to him. This proceeding will be followed by a deed, in due form, conveying the property to the Church. You have no objection to my taking that course? No? My dear Romayne, words are useless at such a time as this. My acts shall speak for me. I am too agitated to say more. Let us talk of something else. Let us have some wine." He filled the glasses. He offered more biscuits. He was really, and even perceptibly, agitated by the victory that he had won. But one last necessity now confronted him, the necessity of placing a serious obstacle in the way of any future change of purpose on the part of Romayne. As to the choice of that obstacle, Father Benwell's mind had been made up for some time past. "What was it I had to say to you?" he resumed. "Surely I was speaking on the subject of your future life." "You are very kind, Father Benwell. The subject has little interest for me. My future life is shaped out. Domestic retirement, ennobled by religious duties." Still pacing the room, Father Benwell stopped at that reply, and put his hand kindly on Romayne's shoulder. "We don't allow a good Catholic to drift into domestic retirement, who is worthy of better things," he said. "The Church, Romayne, wishes to make use of you. I never flattered anyone in my life, but I may say before your face what I have said behind your back. A man of your strict sense of honour, of your intellect, of your high aspirations, of your personal charm and influence, is not a man whom we can allow to run to waste. Open your mind, my friend, fairly to me, and I will open my mind fairly to you. Let me set the example. I say it with authority. An enviable future is before you." Romayne's pale cheeks flushed with excitement. "What future?" he asked eagerly. "Am I free to choose? Must I remind you that a man with a wife cannot think only of himself?" "Suppose you were not a man with a wife?" "What do you mean?" "Romayne, I am trying to break my way through that inveterate reserve which is one of the failings in your character. Unless you can prevail on yourself to tell me those secret thoughts, those unexpressed regrets, which you can confide to no other man, this conversation must come to an end. Is there no yearning in your innermost soul for anything beyond the position which you now occupy?" There was a pause. The flush on Romayne's face faded away. He was silent. "You are not in the confessional," Father Benwell reminded him, with melancholy submission to circumstances. "You are under no obligation to answer me." Romayne roused himself. He spoke in low, reluctant tones. "I am afraid to answer you," he said. That apparently discouraging reply armed Father Benwell with the absolute confidence of success which he had thus far failed to feel. He wound his way deeper and deeper into Romayne's mind, with the delicate ingenuity of penetration of which the practice of years had made him master. "Perhaps I have failed to make myself clearly understood," he said. "I will try to put it more plainly. You are no half-hearted man, Romayne. What you believe fervently. Impressions are not dimly and slowly produced on your mind. As a necessary result, your conversion being once accomplished, your whole soul is given to the faith that is in you. Do I read your character rightly?" "So far as I know it, yes." Father Benwell went on. "Bear in mind what I have just said," he resumed, "and you will understand why I feel it my duty to press the question which you have not answered yet. You have found in the Catholic faith the peace of mind which you have failed to obtain by other means. If I had been dealing with an ordinary man, I should have expected from the change no happier result than this. But I ask you, has that blessed influence taken no deeper and nobler hold on your heart? Can you truly say to me, I am content with what I have gained, I wish for no more? I cannot truly say it, Romayne answered. The time had now come for speaking plainly. Father Benwell no longer advanced to his end under cover of a cloud of words. A little while since, he said, you spoke of Penrose as of a man whose lot in life you longed to share. The career which has associated him with an Indian mission is, as I told you, only adapted to a man of his special character and special gifts. But the career which has carried him into the sacred ranks of the priesthood is open to every man who feels the sense of divine vocation which has made Penrose one of us. No, Father Benwell, not open to every man. I say yes. It is not open to me. I say it is open to you. And more, I enjoin, I command you to dismiss from your mind all merely human obstacles and discouragements. They are beneath the notice of a man who feels himself called to the priesthood. Give me your hand, Romayne. Does your conscience tell you that you are that man? Romayne started to his feet, shaken to the soul by the solemnity of the appeal. I can't dismiss the obstacles that surround me, he cried passionately. To a man in my position, your advice is absolutely useless. The ties that bind me are beyond the limit of a priest's sympathies. Nothing is beyond the limit of a priest's sympathies. Father Benwell, I am married. Father Benwell folded his arms over his breast, looked with immovable resolution straight in Romayne's face, and struck the blow which he had been meditating for months past. Rouse your courage, he said sternly. You are no more married than I am. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Len Nicholson. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. Book the 5th, Chapter 4, On the Road to Rome. There was not a sound in the room. Romayne stood, looking at the priest. Did you hear what I said? Father Benwell asked. Yes. Do you understand that I really mean what I said? He made no reply. He waited, like a man expecting to hear more. Father Benwell was alive to the vast importance at such a moment of not shrinking from the responsibility which he had assumed. I see how I distress you, he said, but for your sake I am bound to speak out. Romayne, the woman whom you have married is the wife of another man. Don't ask me how I know it. I do know it. You shall have positive proof as soon as you have recovered. Come, rest a little in the easy-chair. He took Romayne's arm and led him to the chair and made him drink some wine. They waited a while. Romayne lifted his head with a heavy sigh. The woman whom I have married is the wife of another man. He slowly repeated the words to himself, and then looked at Father Benwell. Who is the man? He asked. I introduced you to him when I was as ignorant of the circumstances as you are, the priest answered. The man is Mr. Bernard Winterfield. Romayne half raised himself from the chair. A momentary anger glittered in his eyes, and faded out again, extinguished by the nobler emotions of grief and shame. He remembered Winterfield's introduction to Stella. Her husband, he said, speaking again to himself. And she let me introduce him to her. And she received him like a stranger. He paused and thought of it. The proofs, if you please, sir, he resumed with sudden humility. I don't want to hear any particulars. It will be enough for me if I know beyond all doubt that I have been deceived and disgraced. Father Benwell unlocked his desk and placed 2 papers before Romayne. He did his duty with a grave indifference to all minor considerations. The time had not yet come for expressions of sympathy and regret. The first paper, he said, is a certified copy of the register of the marriage of Miss Eyrecourt to Mr. Winterfield, celebrated, as you will see, by the English chaplain at Brussels, and witnessed by 3 persons. Look at the names. The bride's mother was the first witness. The 2 names that followed were the names of Lord and Lady Loring. They, too, in the conspiracy to deceive me, Romayne said, as he laid the paper back on the table. I obtained that piece of written evidence, Father Benwell proceeded, by the help of a reverend colleague of mine, residing at Brussels. I will give you his name and address, if you wish to make further inquiries. Quite needless. What is this other paper? This other paper is an extract from the shorthand writer's notes, suppressed in the reports of the public journals, of proceedings in an English court of law, obtained at my request by my lawyer in London. What have I to do with it? He put the question in a tone of passive endurance, resigned to the severest moral martyrdom that could be inflicted on him. I will answer you in 2 words, said Father Benwell. In justice to Miss Eyrecourt, I am bound to produce her excuse for marrying you. Romayne looked at him in stern amazement. Excuse? He repeated. Yes, excuse. The proceedings to which I have alluded declare Miss Eyrecourt's marriage to Mr. Winterfield to be null and void, by the English law, in consequence of his having been married at the time to another woman. Try to follow me. I will put it as briefly as possible. In justice to yourself and to your future career, you must understand this revolting case thoroughly from beginning to end. With those prefatory words, he told the story of Winterfield's first marriage, altering nothing, concealing nothing, doing the fullest justice to Winterfield's innocence of all evil motive, from first to last. When the plain truth served his purpose, as it most assuredly did in this case, the man has never yet been found who could match Father Benwell at stripping himself of every vestige of reserve, and exhibiting his naked heart to the moral admiration of mankind. You were mortified, and I was surprised, he went on, when Mr. Winterfield dropped his acquaintance with you. We now know that he acted like an honourable man. He waited to see what effect he had produced. Romayne was in no state of mind to do justice to Winterfield or to anyone. His pride was mortally wounded. His high sense of honour and delicacy writhed under the outrage inflicted on it. And mind this, Father Benwell persisted, poor human nature has its right to all that can be justly conceded in the way of excuse and allowance. Miss Eyrecourt could naturally be advised by her friends, would naturally be eager, on her own part, to keep hidden from you what happened at Brussels. A sensitive woman, placed in a position so horribly false and degrading, must not be too severely judged, even when she does wrong. I am bound to say this, and more. Speaking from my own knowledge of all the parties, I have no doubt that Miss Eyrecourt and Mr. Winterfield did really part at the church door. Romayne answered by a look, so disdainfully expressive of the most immovable unbelief that it absolutely justified the fatal advice by which Stella's worldly-wise friends had encouraged her to conceal the truth. Father Benwell prudently closed his lips. He had put the case with perfect fairness. His bitterest enemy could not have denied that. Romayne took up the second paper, looked at it, and threw it back again on the table with an expression of disgust. You told me just now, he said, that I was married to the wife of another man, and there is a judge's decision, releasing Miss Eyrecourt from her marriage to Mr. Winterfield. May I ask you to explain yourself? Certainly. Let me first remind you that you owe religious allegiance to the principles which the Church has asserted for centuries past, with all the authority of its divine institution. You admit that? I admit it. Now listen. In our Church, Romayne, marriage is even more than a religious institution. It is a sacrament. We acknowledge no human laws which profane that sacrament. Take 2 examples of what I say. When the great Napoleon was at the height of his power, Pius VII refused to acknowledge the validity of the Emperor's second marriage to Maria Louisa, while Josephine was living, divorced by the French Senate. Again, in the face of the Royal Marriage Act, the Church sanctioned the marriage of Mrs. Fitzherbert to George IV, and still declares, in justice to her memory, that she was the King's lawful wife. In one word, marriage, to be marriage at all, must be the object of a purely religious celebration, and this condition complied with, marriage is only to be dissolved by death. You remember what I told you of Mr. Winterfield? Yes, his first marriage took place before the registrar. In plain English, Romayne, Mr. Winterfield and the woman rider in the circus pronounced a formula of words before a layman in an office. That is not only no marriage, it is a blasphemous profanation of a holy rite. Acts of Parliament which sanction such proceedings are acts of infidelity. The Church declares it, in defence of religion. I understand you, said Romayne. Mr. Winterfield's marriage at Brussels, which the English law, Father Benwell interposed, declares to be annulled by the marriage before the registrar, stands good, nevertheless, by the higher law of the Church. Mr. Winterfield is Miss Eyrecourt's husband as long as they both live. An ordained priest performed the ceremony in a consecrated building, and Protestant marriages so celebrated are marriages acknowledged by the Catholic Church. Under those circumstances, the ceremony which afterward united you to Miss Eyrecourt, though neither you nor the clergyman were to blame, was a mere mockery. Need I to say any more? Shall I leave you for a while by yourself? No, I don't know what I may think. I don't know what I may do, if you leave me by myself. Father Benwell took a chair by Romayne's side. It has been my hard duty to grieve and humiliate you, he said. Do you bear me no ill will? He held out his hand. Romayne took it, as an act of justice, if not as an act of gratitude. Can I be of any use in advising you? Father Benwell asked. Who can advise a man in my position? Romayne bitterly rejoined. I can at least suggest that you should take time to think over your position. Time? Take time? You talk as if my situation was endurable. Everything is endurable, Romayne. It may be so to you, Father Benwell. Did you part with your humanity when you put on the black robe of the priest? I parted, my son, with those weaknesses of our humanity on which women practice. You talk of your position. I will put it before you at its worst. For what purpose? To show you exactly what you have now to decide. Judged by the law of England, Mrs. Romayne is your wife. Judged by the principles held sacred among the religious community to which you belong, she is not Mrs. Romayne. She is Mrs. Winterfield, living with you in adultery. If you regret your conversion, I don't regret it, Father Benwell. If you renounce the holy aspirations which you have yourself acknowledged to me, return to your domestic life. But don't ask us, while you are living with that lady, to respect you as a member of our communion. Romayne was silent. The more violent emotions aroused in him had with time subsided into calm. Tenderness, mercy, past affection, found their opportunity and pleaded with him. The priest's bold language had missed the object at which it aimed. It had revived in Romayne's memory the image of Stella in the days when he had first seen her. How gently her influence had wrought on him for good. How tenderly, how truly she had loved him. "Give me some more wine," he cried. "I feel faint and giddy. Don't despise me, Father Benwell. I was once so fond of her." The priest poured out the wine. "I feel for you," he said. "Indeed, indeed, I feel for you." It was not all a lie. There were grains of truth in that outburst of sympathy. Father Benwell was not wholly merciless. His far-seeing intellect, his daring duplicity, carried him straight on to his end in view. But that end once gained, and let it be remembered not gained in this case, wholly for himself, there were compassionate impulses left in him which sometimes forced their way to the surface. A man of high intelligence, however he may misuse it, however unworthy he may be of it, has a gift from heaven. When you want to see unredeemed wickedness, look for it in a fool. Let me mention one circumstance, Father Benwell proceeded, which may help to relieve you for the moment. In your present state of mind, you cannot return to the retreat. Impossible. I have had a room prepared for you in this house. Here, free from any disturbing influence, you can shape the future course of your life. If you wish to communicate with your residents at Highgate, don't speak of it. Father Benwell sighed. "Ah, I understand," he said sadly. "The house associated with Mr. Winterfield's visit." Romayne again interrupted him, this time by gesture only. The hand that had made the sign clinched itself when it rested afterward on the table. His eyes looked downward, under frowning brows. At the name of Winterfield, remembrances that poisoned every better influence in him rose venomously in his mind. Once more he loathed the deceit that had been practised on him. Once more the detestable doubt of that asserted parting at the church door renewed its stealthy torment, and reasoned with him as if in words. "She has deceived you in one thing. Why not in another?" "Can I see my lawyer here?" he asked suddenly. "My dear Romayne, you can see anyone whom you like to invite. I shall not trouble you by staying very long, Father Benwell. Do nothing in a hurry, my son. Pray do nothing in a hurry." Romayne paid no attention to this entreaty. Shrinking from the momentous decision that awaited him, his mind instinctively took refuge in the prospect of change of scene. "I shall leave England," he said impatiently. "Not alone," Father Benwell remonstrated. "Who will be my companion? "I will," the priest answered. Romayne's weary eyes brightened faintly. In his desolate position, Father Benwell was the one friend on whom he could rely. Penrose was far away. The Lorings had helped to keep him deceived. Major Hynd had openly pitied and despised him as a victim to priestcraft. "Can you go with me at any time?" he asked. "Have you no duties that keep you in England?" "My duties, Romayne, are already confided to other hands." "Then you have foreseen this?" "I have thought it possible. Your journey may be long, or it may be short. You shall not go away alone." "I can think of nothing yet. My mind is a blank," Romayne confessed sadly. "I don't know where I shall go." "I know where you ought to go, and where you will go," said Father Benwell emphatically. "Where?" "To Rome." Romayne understood the true meaning of that brief reply. A vague sense of dismay began to rise in his mind. While he was still tortured by doubt, it seemed as if Father Benwell had, by some inscrutable process of prevision, planned out his future beforehand. Had the priest foreseen events? No, he had only foreseen possibilities. On the day when it first occurred to him that Romayne's marriage was assailable, before the court of Romayne's conscience, from the Roman Catholic point of view. By this means, the misfortune of Romayne's marriage having preceded his conversion might be averted, and the one certain obstacle in the way of any change of purpose on his part, the obstacle of the priesthood, might still be set up by the voluntary separation of the husband from the wife. Thus far the Jesuit had modestly described himself to his reverend colleagues as regarding his position towards Romayne in a new light. His next letter might boldly explain to them what he had really meant. The triumph was won. Not a word more passed between his guest and himself that morning. Before post-time on the same day, Father Benwell wrote his last report to the Secretary of the Society of Jesus in these lines: "Romayne is free from the domestic ties that bound him. He leaves it to me to restore Vange Abbey to the Church, and he acknowledges a vocation for the priesthood. Expect us at Rome in a fortnight's time." End of Chapter 4. End of Book the 5th.
After the story, Chapter 1 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. After the story, Chapter 1. Extracts from Bernard Winterfield's diary. Chapter 1. Winterfield defends himself. Beaupark House, June 17, 1800. You and I, Cousin Beaminster, seldom meet, but I occasionally hear of you from friends acquainted with both of us. I have heard of you last at Sir Philip's rent-day dinner a week since. My name happened to be mentioned by one of the gentlemen present, a guest like yourself. You took up the subject of your own free will, and spoke of me in these terms: "I am sorry to say it of the existing head of the family, but Bernard is really unfit for the position which he holds. He has, to say the least of it, compromised himself and his relatives on more than one occasion. He began as a young man by marrying a circus rider. He got into some other scrape after that, which he has contrived to keep a secret from us. We only know how disgraceful it must have been by the results. He was a voluntary exile from England for more than a year. And now, to complete the list, he has mixed himself up in that miserable and revolting business of Lewis Romayne and his wife. If any other person had spoken of me in this manner, I should have set him down as a mischievous idiot, to be kicked perhaps, but not to be noticed in any other way. With you the case is different. If I die without male offspring, the Beaupark estate goes to you as next heir. I don't choose to let a man in this position slander me, and those dear to me, without promptly contradicting him. The name I bear is precious to me, in memory of my father. Your unanswered allusion to my relations with Lewis Romayne and his wife coming from a member of the family, will be received as truth. Rather than let this be, I reveal to you, without reserve, some of the saddest passages of my life. I have nothing to be ashamed of, and if I have hitherto kept certain events in the dark, it has been for the sake of others, not for my own sake. I know better now. A woman's reputation, if she is a good woman, is not easily compromised by telling the truth. The person of whom I am thinking when I write this knows what I am going to do, and approves of it. You will receive with these lines the most perfectly candid statement that I can furnish, being extracts cut out of my own private diary. They are accompanied, where plain necessity seems to call for it, by the written evidence of other persons. There has never been much sympathy between us, but you have been brought up like a gentleman, and, when you have read my narrative, I expect that you will do justice to me and to others, even though you think we acted indiscreetly under trying and critical circumstances. B.W. End of chapter 1. Read by Lars Rolander.